The morning had started like any other for Tanya Wilson. She woke up at 6, made breakfast for her 2 children, helped them get ready for school, and headed to her job at the local community center. Tanya was known in her neighborhood as someone who always had time to help others, despite raising her kids alone since her husband's passing 3 years ago. Her youngest child, Andra, aged 8, had been sniffling for a couple of days. Tanya had been giving him over-the-counter medicine, hoping it was just a common cold that would pass. But when she picked him up from school that afternoon, his teacher mentioned he'd been unusually quiet and had fallen asleep at his desk twice. "He's burning up," Tanya whispered to herself as she placed her hand on Andrew's forehead in the car. The thermometer at home confirmed her fears, 103.5 degrees, too high to wait until morning. After dropping her daughter off at her sister's place, Tanya drove straight to Greenview Medical Clinic. It wasn't the closest to their home, but it was the one covered by her insurance she worked 2 jobs to maintain. "It'll be okay, baby," she told Andra, who was now shivering despite the warm spring day. "The doctors will give you something to make you feel better." The waiting room at Greenview was half empty when they arrived. Tanya approached the front desk with Andra leaning heavily against her side, his eyes glassy with fever. "My son is very sick," she explained to the receptionist, a thin woman with blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. The nameplate on the desk read Nancy Wilson. Nancy barely looked up from her computer. "Fill these out," she said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "And I'll need to see your insurance card." Tanya juggled holding Andra, who could barely stand, while completing the paperwork. She noticed her hand was shaking as she wrote. When she returned the forms, Nancy glanced at them briefly. "Take a seat. We'll call to you when it's your turn." Tanya helped Andra to a chair and sat beside him, letting him rest his head on her lap. His curly hair was damp with sweat, and his breathing seemed labored. 20 minutes passed, then 40. A white couple walked in with a teenage girl who was laughing and texting on her phone. They checked in and were called back 15 minutes later. An elderly man came in complaining of back pain. He too was seen before them. After an hour, Tanya approached the desk again. Andrew was getting worse, his skin hot to the touch, his eyes struggling to stay open. "Excuse me," she said politely, "my son's fever is very high. Is there any way we could see the doctor soon? I'm really worried about him." Nancy looked up with a flat expression. "Everyone here has problems, ma'am. You need to wait your turn. We have procedures." "But he's gotten worse since we arrived," Tanya persisted, keeping her voice level despite the panic rising in her chest. "If you feel it's an emergency, you can always try the county hospital," Nancy replied with a slight edge to her voice, loud enough for others in the waiting room to hear. Tanya felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She knew what Nancy was implying, that people like her should go to the public hospital, not this clean, private clinic in the better part of town. She returned to her seat, holding Andra close. Another family came in. A mother with twin boys who seemed to be fighting over a toy. They were called in 20 minutes later, despite arriving well after Tanya and Andra. 2 hours had now passed. Andra's breathing had become shallow, and he wasn't responding properly when Tanya spoke to him. She watched in growing desperation as patient after patient was called ahead of them. A young couple sitting nearby kept glancing over with concerned expressions. The woman, who had been thumbing through a magazine, finally caught Tanya's eye and gave her a sympathetic smile. It was the first bit of kindness Tanya had experienced since walking into the clinic. 3 hours, Tanya whispered to herself, checking her watch again. 3 hours we've been waiting while my baby gets sicker. She stood up, determination replacing her earlier attempts at politeness. Something was very wrong here, and she wasn't going to sit quietly anymore while her son suffered. Tanya took a deep breath and gently laid Andrew's head on the chair. "I'll be right back, honey," she whispered. Her legs felt stiff after sitting for so long. She straightened her back, smoothed down her uniform, she hadn't even had time to change after work, and walked up to the front desk with purpose in each step. "My son needs to see a doctor now," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "He's been waiting for 3 hours and he's getting worse by the minute." Nancy looked up with cold eyes. "Please lower your voice. There are other patients here." "Yes, I've noticed," Tanya replied. I've noticed all the patients who came after us getting seen before us. I've been patient and polite, but my son is seriously ill." A few people in the waiting room were now watching. An older man with gray hair nodded slightly, as if agreeing with Tanya. "I've already explained that we have procedures," Nancy said, typing something into her computer without looking up. "Everyone thinks their situation is special." "This isn't about being special," Tanya said, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. "This is about my child who can barely stay awake and has a dangerously high fever. I need to speak to the doctor, now." The door behind the reception desk opened, and a tall man in a white coat stepped out. His name badge read Dr. Thomas Brown. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Nancy and Tanya with a frown. "Dr. Brown," Tanya began, relief washing over her. "My son Andra has been waiting for 3 hours. His fever is over 103, he's having trouble breathing, and he's getting worse. We really need help." The doctor's eyes flicked to Nancy, then back to Tanya. His expression didn't soften. "Ma'am, we're very busy today, as you can see," he said, gesturing to the half-empty waiting room. "Everyone will be seen in due time." "Due time?" Tanya echoed in disbelief. "My son could have been seen hours ago. Why are people who came in after us getting called first?" Dr. Brown crossed his arms. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the county hospital. They're better equipped to handle various situations." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Tanya felt a surge of anger mixed with heartbreak. She'd encountered this before: the subtle suggestions, the dismissive tone, the assumption that she and her son somehow belonged elsewhere. "My insurance covers this clinic," Tanya said evenly. "We have every right to be here, and my son deserves medical care just like everyone else who walks through that door." Nancy cleared her throat. "Actually, there seems to be an issue with your insurance. It's showing as pending in our system." "That's impossible," Tanya said. "You verified it when we checked in. You said everything was fine." "Well, I'm seeing something different now," Nancy replied, turning her monitor slightly as if to shield it from Tanya's view. The young couple who had been watching earlier exchanged glances. The woman stood up and approached Tanya. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm a nurse at Memorial Hospital, and from what I can see, your son needs medical attention right away." Dr. Brown's smile was tight. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm the physician here." "Then act like one," the woman challenged quietly. "That child is clearly in distress." An uncomfortable silence fell over the waiting room. Tanya felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "I'm not leaving until my son gets treatment," she said. "And if anything happens to him because of this delay, I want everyone here to know I'll hold this clinic responsible." Dr. Brown's face hardened. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm stating a fact," Tanya replied. "My son has been showing signs of serious illness for 3 hours while sitting right there in your waiting room. I've asked for help repeatedly. This is all on camera, I assume." She nodded toward the security device in the corner of the ceiling. Something flickered across Dr. Brown's face. Uncertainty, perhaps even worry. "Nancy," he said after a moment, "please prepare an examination room for—" He paused, looking at Tanya expectantly. "Andra," she supplied, not bothering to hide the coldness in her voice. "His name is Andra Wilson, and yes, it's in all the paperwork I filled out 3 hours ago." As Tanya turned to go back to her son, the older man who had nodded earlier caught her eye and gave her a supple thumbs up. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything to her. She wasn't alone in recognizing what was happening here. She just hoped it wasn't too late for Andra. Tanya walked back to where Andra was slumped in the waiting room chair. His eyes were half closed, and his breathing seemed faster than before. When she touched his cheek, his skin felt like fire. "They're going to see us now, baby," she said, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. She gently shook his shoulder. "Andra, can you hear me?" Andra's eyes fluttered but didn't fully open. He mumbled something Tanya couldn't make out. "I need to get you to the examination room. Can you stand up?" She slid her arm around his small shoulders and tried to help him up. His legs wobbled, and he leaned heavily against her. Something was very wrong. In the 3 hours they'd been waiting, his condition had gotten much worse. "We're going to see the doctor now," Tanya said, her heart pounding as she felt how weak he was. They had taken only 2 steps when Andrew's eyes rolled back. His small body went completely limp, and he collapsed to the floor before Tanya could catch him. "Help!" she screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Somebody help my son." The waiting room erupted in chaos. The nurse who had spoken up earlier rushed over, pushing chairs out of the way. "I'm Lisa," she said quickly, kneeling beside Andra. "I'm a pediatric nurse. Let me help." Lisa checked Andrew's pulse, then placed her hand on his forehead. "How long has he had this fever?" "It started this morning," Tanya said, her voice shaking, "but it got much worse after school." Nancy peered over the reception desk but didn't move. Dr. Brown stood in the doorway, watching with a frown. "This child needs immediate attention," Lisa called out, her voice sharp with authority. "He's showing signs of severe respiratory distress. Are you going to stand there, or are you going to do your job, doctor?" Other patients had stood up. The older man who had nodded at Tanya earlier spoke up. "For God's sake, the boy is unconscious on your floor. Do something." Dr. Brown finally moved, but slowly, as if reluctant. "We'll need to move him to an examination room." "No kidding," Lisa muttered under her breath. Looking up at Tanya, she said, "I'm staying with you. This isn't right." 2 medical assistants appeared with the gunny. As they lifted Andra, Tanya noticed how small and fragile he looked. His chest was rising and falling too rapidly, and there was a bluish tint around his lips that hadn't been there before. "I'm coming with him," Tanya insisted as they started to wheel him away. "Family needs to wait," Nancy began. "Don't even try it," Lisa cut in. "She's coming with her son." They rushed Andra into an examination room where Dr. Brown finally seemed to recognize the seriousness of the situation. He called for oxygen and began checking Andrew's vital signs. "Pulse is rapid, oxygen saturation is low," he muttered. "How long has he been like this?" "I've been telling you for 3 hours that he was seriously ill," Tanya said, not bothering to hide her anger now. "You kept us waiting while he got worse right in front of you." Dr. Brown didn't respond to that. He placed a stethoscope on Andrew's chest, listening intently. Significant congestion in both lungs. "Get a chest X-ray stat and start him on broad-spectrum antibiotics. This looks like pneumonia, and it's advanced." Tanya felt the room spin around her. Pneumonia. The word hung in the air like a terrible accusation. If they had seen Andra when they first arrived, would it have gotten this bad? "Would he be okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Brown finally met her eyes, and for the first time he looked concerned. "We're going to do everything we can, but I won't lie to you, this is serious. The infection has progressed significantly." "Because you made him wait," Lisa said quietly but firmly. "This didn't have to get this far." The medical assistants moved quickly around Andra, attaching monitors, placing an oxygen mask over his face, inserting an IV line. The room filled with the sound of beeping machines and urgent voices. Tanya stood pressed against the wall, feeling helpless as she watched strangers work on her son. Her little boy, who had been laughing just yesterday, complaining about math homework, and asking for a second helping of dinner. Now he lay unconscious, fighting for every breath. "I'm right here," Andra, she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "Mama's right here." Lisa stood beside her, a silent support in the storm. "Documentation," she whispered to Tanya. "Remember everything that's happening. Every minute they made you wait, every excuse they gave. This shouldn't have happened." Tanya nodded, tears streaming down her face, but beneath the fear and grief, a flame of determination was growing. If Andra pulled through this, when he pulled through this, someone would answer for what had happened today. The next few hours passed in a blur of beeping machines, rushing medical staff, and whispered conversations just out of Tanya's earshot. She refused to leave Andra's side, watching as his oxygen levels slowly improved with treatment. When Dr. Brown announced they would transfer Andra to Children's Memorial Hospital for specialized care, Tanya felt both relief and lingering anger. "He needs to be under the care of a pediatric pulmonologist," Dr. Brown explained, not quite meeting her eyes. "The ambulance will be here in 20 minutes. As soon as he left the room, Lisa approached Tanya. She'd stayed well past her break, helping monitor Andra and offering quiet support. "I need to tell you something," Lisa said, her voice low. What happened today wasn't right. I've worked in healthcare for 12 years, and I know discrimination when I see it. Tanya nodded, too exhausted for words. I recorded some of what happened after Andra collapsed. Lisa continued, showing Tanya her phone. The way they responded, or didn't respond, and some of what Dr. Brown said when he thought no one was listening. What did he say? Tanya asked, suddenly alert. He told Nancy they needed to get the paperwork in order and make sure everything looks proper in the records. He was covering their tracks, Tanya. Lisa's words hung in the air between them. I'm not asking you to do anything with this information right now, she added. Just focus on Andra. But when you're ready, I'll send you these recordings. Here's my number. As Lisa wrote her contact information on a slip of paper, the door to the examination room opened. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair peeked in. Excuse me, he said. I'm Robert. I was in the waiting room. I just wanted to check if your boy is doing okay. He's stable, Tanya said, surprised by the visit. They're transferring him to Children's Memorial. Robert nodded. Good, that's good. He hesitated, then stepped further into the room. Look, I saw everything that happened out there. The way they kept pushing you aside, making excuses. I've been coming to this clinic for years, and I've never waited more than 30 minutes to see Dr. Brown. Tanya felt a lump form in her throat. 3 hours, she whispered. It wasn't right, Robert said firmly. And I want you to know I'd be willing to make a statement about what I saw. I'm a high school principal. People tend to listen when I talk. He smiled slightly, handing her a business card. My contact information. Call me if you need a witness. After Robert left, Lisa touched Tanya's arm. You're not alone in this, she said. What happened today wasn't just poor service, it was dangerous. And there's one more thing you should know. Lisa pointed to the corner of the ceiling where a small black dome was mounted. Security cameras. They record everything in the waiting room and hallways. If you ever decide to take action, those recordings would show exactly how long you waited while others were seen ahead of you. The door opened again, this time revealing a younger man wearing glasses and hospital scrubs. Ms. Wilson, I'm David from hospital administration. I need to speak with you about the transfer paperwork. As he approached, Tanya noticed he was carrying a stack of forms. He lowered his voice. I heard about what happened. My sister works at the front desk in the ER, and word travels fast. David shuffled through his papers, pulling out a form and placing it on top. This is a request for all of Andra's medical records, including time-stamped notes and waiting room check-in information. If I were you, I'd fill this out before leaving. By law, they have to provide these records within 30 days. Tanya looked at the form, then back at David's face. His expression was professional, but his eyes held unmistakable concern. Why aren't you helping me? She asked quietly. David glanced toward the door to make sure no one was listening. My nephew has sickle cell anemia. Last year, a doctor ignored his pain crisis because he thought he was drug-seeking. By the time they finally treated him properly, he almost didn't make it. He paused. Some battles need to be fought so they don't happen again. As the paramedics arrived to transfer Andra, Tanya gathered the business card, phone number, and forms. Each piece of paper felt like a small weight in her pocket, the beginning of something she hadn't planned but now couldn't ignore. We'll follow right behind the ambulance, Lisa promised as they wheeled Andra toward the exit. Your sister is bringing your daughter to the hospital, right? Tanya nodded, suddenly remembering the world outside this room. Her daughter. Her job. The rent due next week. How would she manage all this while fighting for her son? Then she looked at Andra's face, peaceful now under the oxygen mask, and knew she would find a way. She had to. 3 days later, Tanya sat by Andra's hospital bed, watching him sleep peacefully. The antibiotics were working, and the pediatric pulmonologist had just shared good news. Andra would make a full recovery, though it would take time. His little chest still rose and fell too quickly, but the blue tint of his lips was gone, and he could speak in full sentences again without gasping for air. Tanya hadn't left the hospital since the ambulance ride. Her sister brought clean clothes and took care of Tanya's daughter, while her boss at the community center told her to take all the time she needed. The kindness of others kept her going, but so did something else. A slow-burning determination that grew stronger each time she thought about those 3 hours in the waiting room. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. A woman with warm brown skin and a tailored gray suit stood in the doorway. "Ms. Wilson, I'm Patricia Reynolds. Lisa suggested I come by." The woman's voice was gentle but carried a note of authority. "I'm a civil rights attorney. May I come in?" Tanya nodded, suddenly nervous. She'd been gathering evidence as Lisa and David suggested, but she hadn't actually decided what to do with it. The thought of taking on a medical clinic felt overwhelming. Patricia sat in the chair opposite Tanya. "How's your boy doing?" "Better," Tanya said. "They say he can go home in a few days if he keeps improving." "I'm glad to hear that." Patricia's smile was genuine. "Lisa told me what happened at Greenview. She was very concerned." Tanya looked at Andra, then back at Patricia. "They let him get worse right in front of them. The doctor even tried to send us away." Patricia nodded. "Unfortunately, what happened to you and Andra isn't an isolated incident. In fact, after Lisa contacted me, I did some digging." She opened a folder she'd been carrying. "There have been 6 formal complaints against Greenview Clinic in the past 2 years, all from minority patients who experienced unusual delays or were redirected to other facilities despite having proper insurance." Tanya's eyes widened. 6 complaints. And those are just the people who went through the trouble of filing paperwork. Most people don't. Patricia leaned forward. "Ms. Wilson, what happened to Andra wasn't just bad service. It was medical negligence with a pattern of racial discrimination behind it." The words hung in the air, putting a name to what Tanya had felt but hadn't fully articulated. "What can I do?" Tanya asked finally. "You have options," Patricia said. "With the evidence you've gathered, the security footage Lisa mentioned, the witness statements, Andra's medical records showing the progression of his condition during that 3-hour wait, we could file a formal complaint with the state medical board. Or we could pursue a civil rights lawsuit against the clinic." Tanya looked at Andra again. "I don't want money. I just want them to change how they treat people." Patricia smiled. "Sometimes the way to make institutions change is to hit them where it hurts, their reputation and their finances. A lawsuit would do both." She paused. "There's something else you should know. A local news reporter named Daniel Thompson has been investigating healthcare disparities in our city. When he heard about what happened to Andra, he contacted me." "A news story?" Tanya hadn't considered that possibility. "Only if you're comfortable with it," Patricia assured her. "But sometimes public pressure can achieve what legal action alone cannot." Just then, Andra stirred and opened his eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice still raspy. "I'm right here, baby," Tanya said, taking his hand. "Can we go home yet?" "Soon," she promised, fighting back tears. Looking back at Patricia, she made her decision. "I want to do this, not just for Andra, but for everyone who's been treated this way. What do we need to do first?" Patricia handed her a folder. "These are the forms to request the security footage before it gets accidentally erased. We'll also need to file for Andra's complete medical records, including all timestamps of check-in and treatment." As Patricia explained the next steps, Tanya felt a strange mix of emotions: fear about taking on this fight, worry about Andra's recovery, but also a growing sense of purpose. She thought about Dr. Brown's dismissive attitude and Nancy's cold stare. She remembered the other families called ahead of them, and Andra collapsing because help came too late. "They need to answer for what they did," Tanya said quietly. "And they need to make sure it never happens to another child." Patricia nodded. "Then let's make sure of that." 6 weeks after Andra's hospitalization, Tanya sat in the back row of a packed hearing room at the state medical board. She smoothed down her dress, the nicest one she owned, and tried to calm her racing heart. Patricia sat beside her, reviewing notes and occasionally leaning over to whisper reassurances. "They can't ignore evidence this strong," Patricia murmured. "The security footage alone tells the whole story." That footage had become the centerpiece of their case. It showed, in painful detail, Tanya and Andra arriving at the clinic, checking in, and then sitting for 3 full hours while multiple families who arrived later were called back. It captured Andra's deteriorating condition and his eventual collapse. Most stunning of all, it recorded Dr. Brown's reluctance to treat him even after he'd lost consciousness. The hearing room doors opened, and Dr. Brown entered with his attorney, a stern-looking woman in an expensive suit. He looked smaller somehow, his confident manner replaced by nervous glances around the room. When he spotted Tanya, he quickly looked away. Nancy followed behind them, along with the clinic director, Dr. Paul Winters, who had not been present that day but was ultimately responsible for clinic policies. "All rise," called the board secretary as 5 medical board members filed in and took their seats at the elevated table. Dr. Helen Cho, the board chairperson, adjusted her glasses and looked out at the crowded room. "This hearing is now in session. Today we address serious allegations against Greenview Medical Clinic, Dr. Thomas Brown, and staff members regarding discriminatory practices and medical negligence." What followed was 3 hours of testimony that left many in the room shocked and angry. Lisa described what she had witnessed that day in clear professional terms. Robert explained how he had been a patient at the clinic for years and had never waited more than half an hour. But the most powerful testimony came from others who began to step forward. Tanya watched in amazement as one person after another approached the microphone, patients who had experienced similar treatment at Greenview. An elderly woman with arthritis described being told her pain was just in her head, while white patients received immediate pain management. A Hispanic father told how his daughter's broken arm wasn't x-rayed for nearly 2 hours despite her obvious distress. A young black college student explained how her symptoms were dismissed as anxiety when she actually had a serious heart condition. Then came the former employees. A medical assistant who had quit 6 months earlier described the unwritten rules at Greenview. "Dr. Brown told us to prioritize certain patients. His words were the ones who can afford to go elsewhere. He said other patients would wait regardless because they had fewer options." Her voice shook as she spoke. "I left because I couldn't be part of that system anymore." When it was Tanya's turn to speak, she stood tall despite her nervousness. She didn't use fancy words or legal terms. She simply told the truth about what had happened to her son. "Andor almost died because they decided we weren't important enough," she concluded. "No mother should have to watch her child get sicker by the minute while help is right there but denied. No child should suffer because of the color of their skin." The clinic's defense was weak at best. Their lawyer tried to frame the incidents as unfortunate misunderstandings and staffing issues. Dr. Brown claimed he had been unaware of any pattern of discrimination. But the evidence was overwhelming, especially after Daniel Thompson's investigative report had aired on the local news, prompting even more former patients to come forward. After deliberation, Dr. Cho delivered the board's decision. Her voice was firm as she read from a prepared statement. "The evidence presented today shows a disturbing pattern of discrimination and substandard care at Greenview Medical Clinic. Such behavior has no place in our healthcare system." The penalties were severe. Dr. Brown's medical license was suspended for 6 months, with mandatory ethics training before reinstatement. Nancy was permanently barred from working in medical administration. The clinic was placed on probation, required to implement comprehensive anti-bias training, and faced significant financial penalties. As people began to file out of the hearing room, a reporter approached Tanya. "How do you feel about the board's decision?" Tanya looked over at Andor, who was sitting with her sister in the hallway, playing a game on her phone. He was healthy again, back in school, his smile as bright as ever. "It's a start," she said simply, "but this isn't the end." 8 months after the hearing, Tanya stood in front of Greenview Medical Clinic, barely recognizing the place. Gone was the cold, unwelcoming atmosphere. The walls had been repainted in warm colors, and the waiting room, visible through the glass doors, had been redesigned with comfortable seating arranged in small, friendly clusters rather than rigid rows. But the changes went far deeper than paint and furniture. "Ready?" Patricia asked, touching Tanya's arm lightly. Tanya nodded, taking a deep breath. Today was the official reopening of the clinic under new management, and somehow she had become the guest of honor. Inside, a small crowd had gathered. There were board members from the hospital network that owned the clinic, local community leaders, healthcare workers in white coats and scrubs, and several families who had come forward with their own stories of discrimination after hearing about Andrew's case. Dr. Winters was gone, replaced by Dr. Amara Johnson, a respected physician with a reputation for community-centered care. Nancy had been replaced too, by David, the hospital administrator who had first helped Tanya gather evidence. He gave her a warm smile and a thumbs up from across the room. "Ms. Wilson, we're ready to begin if you are," said Dr. Johnson, approaching with a genuine smile. Unlike Dr. Brown, she looked Tanya directly in the eyes when she spoke. As the room quieted down, Dr. Johnson stepped to a small podium set up in the corner of the waiting area. "Today marks a new beginning for Greenview Clinic," she began. "One that would not have been possible without the courage of one mother who refused to accept that her child deserved anything less than equal, compassionate care." Tanya felt her cheeks warm as people turned to look at her. Andra, standing beside her in his best shirt, squeezed her hand proudly. "The changes we've made aren't just cosmetic," Dr. Johnson continued. "We've completely restructured our policies, hiring practices and training. Our staff now reflects the diversity of the community we serve. We've implemented a transparent triage system so patients understand exactly why someone might be seen before or after them." She gestured toward a large screen on the wall that showed the current wait times and the number of patients being seen, organized by urgency rather than arrival time. But perhaps the most important change is one that Ms. Wilson herself suggested: our new Community Health Advisory Board. Dr. Johnson invited Tanya to the podium. Tanya hadn't prepared a speech, but as she looked around at the faces watching her, she knew exactly what she wanted to say. "8 months ago, I brought my sick son to this clinic and was made to feel like we didn't matter," she began, her voice stronger than she expected. "Today, I'm here as part of the solution. Our advisory board includes people from all parts of this community: parents, teachers, community leaders, and former patients. We'll meet monthly with clinic staff to make sure everyone's voice is heard and everyone receives equal care." She looked down at Andra, who was beaming up at her. "No parent should have to fight for their child to receive basic medical attention, and thanks to what we've accomplished together, fewer parents will have to." The room broke into applause. As Tanya stepped back, Lisa, now the clinic's new head nurse, approached with a large pair of ceremonial scissors for the ribbon cutting. After the ceremony, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Tanya found herself face to face with someone she hadn't expected to see: Dr. Brown. He looked different, humbler somehow. The 6 months without his medical license had clearly changed him. "Ms. Wilson," he said quietly, "I owe you and your son an apology." Tanya studied his face, searching for the dismissive doctor who had nearly cost Andra his life. Instead, she saw someone who seemed genuinely remorseful. "I spent the past months reflecting on my actions and biases," he continued. "The ethics training was just the beginning. I've been working with a community health center in my neighborhood, volunteering my time and really listening to patients. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that what you did changed more than just this clinic. It changed me." Tanya wasn't ready to forgive, but she appreciated his honesty. "What matters is that you're learning and doing better," she said simply. As she walked away to join Andra, who was happily showing off the new kids' corner to his sister, Tanya felt a sense of completion. The settlement money from the lawsuit had helped pay off her debts and establish a college fund for her children. But more importantly, it had created a scholarship program for minority students pursuing healthcare careers. "Mom, look, they have books about kid doctors that look like me," Andra called excitedly. Tanya smiled, watching her healthy, happy son surrounded by the positive changes their difficult journey had created. Sometimes fighting back wasn't just about winning. It was about transforming pain into progress that would help others long after the battle was over.